Now we're ready. All right. So
Right.
welcome to a class that I'm doing with a gentleman that I reached out to him. I read some of his resources, and he's an expert professor, scholar of ancient Near Eastern history, specifically focusing on Mesopotamia. He turned out to be like the nicest guy, really nice guy, very approachable. And man, I told him, "Will you be my teacher?" And now he has accepted teaching me. And I proposed an idea to him. I say, "Hey, why don't we like get together and maybe bring some topics you may want to talk about? I could ask questions, and I'm learning. I could ask questions, and it also I have an agenda. I do have. I told them, by the way, I have an agenda. I've been studying ancient Near East now for the last going on 15, I think. I lose count. Yeah, going on 15 years, and I also want to learn. I want to get better. I want to correct. I want to make sure that I expand my knowledge on the subject, but more so, I want to validate information. And who better than people who are actually in the forefront and the top tier of understanding, who met some of the precursors of this message? And I think it's important that we, as students of the Bible, um, be accountable and responsible what we say, because sometimes we quote something and we don't take the time to validate the information. I think that it is imperative that we are accountable and responsible. And for me, we can spiritualize something, but I think it's also very important to give concrete evidence into what we believe, and specifically more myself, because I'm a Bible student, I'm a Bible teacher, I'm a believer, just like the professor is, but he's focused more on the secular aspect of presenting the information. I'm trying to take that perspective and apply it into the regular person and sitting and listening to the Bible, and trying to maybe bring a connection between both. And that's what we're doing. He's helping me be consistent with the information so I could be the best teacher possible. So, Professor, you started talking before recording, but anyway, welcome again this week to
Oh,
another week of instruction from you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much.
That's great. So again, let me ask you a question, because it started recording in the middle of it. So how do you like retired life? You retired in May.
Yes, I retired in May, and it's not terribly different. I think I said this last time, but I used to tease my students that on 3 days a week I'd stay at home reading and writing and thinking, and on 2 days I'd come to campus and talk about what I learned
Uh-huh.
within some sort of framework. But now I don't have to go over to campus, although I ride every morning. I ride my bicycle and I ride it through campus,
Uh,
so I can wave to the old buildings. But I'm still doing pretty much the same thing, except that I can do it at my own pace. And I used to joke with students that when they were talking about how frustrating it was to be taking exams all the time, I said, I remember being a student, and I said, the only time I had to actually think about things in my field was perhaps in the summer when I wasn't taking courses. And so now I'm in a perpetual summer where I'm always sitting and thinking, and basically I can read what I want at my leisure. And then when I have been asked to do something like this, oh, okay, I'll read up a little bit on Gilgamesh, then move on to something else. I've got all sorts of ideas in the fire that I'm working on, but I'm working on them at my own pace. And so when somebody down the road asks me to give a talk, I'll be ready for it, unless they give me a specific topic.
that's
Uh,
great. But I
yeah.
think what we're doing is kind of different, because you pick the topics that you may want to expound on, then I think they're very relevant to the story and the narratives. I think it's kind of fun to do it that way, and connect some of the biblical principles with all the research that you have done over the years. Who Let me ask you this. What challenge have you had in the years that you've presented this to believers, regardless of the denomination? As you know, they have the hypothesis. Many people, when they go to college, they learn about the hypothesis about the literary gender of the Bible, and many of them, they wonder, what is this? What's going on here? I mean, is the Bible legit? Is God plagiarizing what the ancients did? And they don't seem to understand that there's an underlying theme that the writers of the Bible are trying to convey. Sometimes we're so concrete and over spiritual that we're not really grasping the message behind the message, just like we're going to cover today.
Well, and I think that's the issue, is that we spiritualize it, and then we forget that it was written in a real live context. And so, my goal has been to try to understand that context. And so And over the years, students, especially Christian students, have been very threatened when they find out, oh my goodness. And so God gave this to Moses, but somebody wrote laws that are similar to this that were maybe half a millennium earlier than Moses. How does that work? And
Right.
I said, so I asked them a naive question. I said, why is that a problem for you? If it was written in a real life context, wouldn't you expect that there are some similarities? And frankly, I think the similarities for us look dramatic, but I think they're superficial when you put them in their original context. I suppose it would be like, if I look at East Asian civilization, I might naively look at Chinese civilization and civilization in in well, Taiwan or Japan or Vietnam and say, well, it looks pretty much the same to me, because I'm from a very, very different culture. But of course, they would start barking at me. Wait a minute, no, we're very different.
Right.
Let
Right.
let me show you how we're different. And I think the Israelites would be doing the same thing. Well, of course, we speak like this. This is how. This is they're using cognate languages. Um, and the fact that Hammurabi was writing earlier is somewhat irrelevant because of course they're using the same literary genres. They have the same overall legal system.
Right.
And maybe that'll be a future talk, by the way, about the whole issue of law. And even the flood stories, they're clearly similar, but it doesn't mean that the Israelite writer is sitting there, thinking, I've got to have a
Right.
good story. Let me see if I can find it. Let me grab hold of an earlier one. They're all drawing from the same traditions.
Yeah.
Uh,
Don't give it away. We're going to introduce it here in a minute, but we kind of want to talk to you a little bit about the mindset of the audience in regards to, I've been studying engineering now for a while. I've been presenting it. And within the circles that I've talked to, in the religious circle that I speak with, some particular audience, I remember being one of the few. There's another sister, who's a scholar herself, Dina Dai, who's been introducing this a long time, also. But it's like when we started teaching it, we began teaching others about it. I think it has really opened the eyes to a lot of people to the fact that the Bible was written in a real scenario and surrounded by real people and laws and documents and a real culture. And I really got onto this because I studied the temple. The temple for me is the essence of understanding all of this because let me tell you how it started for me. I remember back in 2000, I think 2009, when I was doing a study about the mitzvot or the commandments, 613. I wanted to learn them and I wanted to teach and share the most basic principles of them. But there's a commandment that says that a man should not, I mean, that the priest should not go up on the altar, with on nakedness. In other words, you have to cover all the way to the ankles. I'm thinking, surely that has to have a context for the time frame because it's illogical to us in the Western world. What does it matter? Plus, it has to be a ramp, not stairs. And the Bible is very strict about that. So I'm thinking, I began to ask questions: when, why, how come, where, all that stuff. And I called a buddy of mine who's a Hebrew scholar in Israel. And it kind of got me upset in a way because I asked him the question. It took me forever to get the answer, Professor. And he does it. He just turns around, picks up a book. He goes to a page. Oh yeah, because in Egypt the priests used to like wear barely nothing, and then but in this, and I'm going like, how in the world did you get an answer in 30 seconds? It's taking me all kinds of ways to try to find it, and it's because of ancient Near Eastern culture, and that was the clue for me. But then when I got into the legality of the Bible, biblical law, everything changed.
yeah,
Now things began to be real. And, you know, this is one of the things I struggle trying to present the message to believers that want to first spiritualize things instead of understanding that even Paul said it, the physical and then the spiritual.
yeah,
So I'm hoping that these meetings that you and I have may be a glimpse of an open door to people to open their minds to say, we're not minimizing the Bible. We're not saying the Bible is just like any other book or any other document. We're saying that the narrative in the Bible is trying to give us a message, and the events that occur they are there and they're happening because it has a meaning and a historical account that reflects our relationship with God. I mean, I hope that makes sense. But today we're going to go into Gilgamesh. Professor, if you allow me just 1 minute to give to the audience a little bit of the background on this, correct me if I get the dates wrong. Uh, Gilgamesh is a semi-mythical Mesopotamian king, a hero who appears in an epic poem, an Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, what's interesting is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this guy was a tyrant, for what I understand.
If you read the first lines of the standard Babylonian tradition, yes, he's a
It's
tyrant,
amazing. The
father
guy
of
was
men and women. Yes.
it's incredible what he was doing. So that right there in itself sets off the difference between, now I know why Genesis chapter 6 says that God says, and you are Tamim Vesadik, for you are righteous and perfect in your generation. Now that makes sense because God is pointing out to Noah that he is a righteous man and that he is purity. He's not an oppressor. He's not a tyrant. It's quite interesting. So, written in Akkadian around 2150 to 1400 BCE, approximately, the Epic of Gilgamesh is considered the world's oldest epic poem. So, instead of me continue to read, I'm going to ask the professor, help us and teach us a little bit about how this history can help us understand the flood story and the biblical events.
Well, first of all, the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh himself is probably a real king. Living, we're guessing, somewhere in the mid-3rd millennium. His city is Uruk, which is called Erech in the book of Genesis. It's certainly the same city. It's the first city that we know of that has writing, by the way, by somewhere in the late 4th millennium BC, so maybe 3,500 or later. We can't date it precisely, and I don't know how that works. Nobody does. But Gilgamesh is probably around, right now they estimate 26 or 2700 BC, and one or two of the individuals that are mentioned in early Gilgamesh traditions, we've actually found an inscription with their name on it, so we assume because of that Gilgamesh would be a real character. But this may be no different than saying that Hercules was originally a real character. It doesn't mean that the traditions have not been expanded on greatly. And so, do we have any kernel of truth about the real Gilgamesh? Perhaps. Anyway, there's the Gilgamesh tradition is actually very, very complicated because there are about 6 or 7 Gilgamesh stories written in Sumerian and are copied. And Sumerian goes on all sorts of different adventures. Actually, there's about a dozen of them in Sumerian, and about half of them make it to the Gilgamesh epic. And so, in fact, the person who writes the standard Babylonian edition, which is evidently somewhere in the Kassite period, which is around 1400 or a little bit later, has woven together about half a dozen of the Gilgamesh stories into this longer poem. And by the way, we know his name, Simlekili Unini, and he's actually described, he's not called an author, he's called a weaver, because he's weaving together stories. And that might be another one of our topics is the holy authorship. But that's
is this connected to the Atrahasis epic?
Yes, but we're not sure how. And so one of the stories about Gilgamesh in the 11th tablet of the standard Babylonian version, which, by the way, we only know about it because it was copied in Ashurbanipal's library, the king of Assyria, in the 7th century BC. And so he wanted to copy these texts. And so he actually had it copied from the standard Babylonian, even though he's an Assyrian living in the north. And though they're writing in the same language, the dialect's very, very different.
Right.
Sorry to bring that up.
Well, kings have many libraries anyway, so it was a custom of kings to collect documents, especially big kings with great kingdoms. They were known for the literary preservation of different cultures.
Yes, and interestingly, of course, his library was pretty much the first thing that was excavated by Laird in the 1840s, and so it gave us a very skewed view of things. In fact, because of that, we called the cuneiform language, the script and the language that was with it, we called it Assyrian, and this is why the misnomer became normalized. Assyriologist is the person who studies that, even though we found out later on that Assyrian was simply a dialect. Babylonian was a dialect of something that we call Akkadian.
Right. The Akkadian language, for what I understand, was basically like the English language is today, the business language of the world. I mean,
Well, later on, it would be the international language.
right, correct. Yeah.
So,
Quite interesting. Would you give me 1 second to let the audience know what the Atrahasis, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. The Epic of Atrahasis, approximately 17th century BC. Atrahasis epic is one of the most complete flood accounts coming from Mesopotamian sources. The Babylonian story parallels biblical account of Genesis 6 to 9 at several points. One of it is that humans have displeased the gods. The gods gave Atrahasis 7 days warning before the flood. The gods instruct him how to survive the coming deluge. Atrahasis built a boat and gathers animals and birds. All mankind is destroyed except Atrahasis makes an offering to God, and the offering is accepted. Quite interesting. Very interesting parallels.
now, just to muddy the waters a little bit more, there's an earlier Sumerian version that's fragmented. That was also written about the same time. It's probably a copy of something from Sumerian, but by the way, by the 1700s, Sumerian which is the earliest attested written language. It's as close to Akkadian as English is to Chinese, and so they have nothing in common except that they were interwoven together. And so if you were a scribe, you were a Sumerian / Akkadian scribe. You knew both of them.
Yeah.
By the time all this was being written down, Sumerian was probably a dead language. It was no longer being used by a regular population, kind of like Latin, I suppose, in the Middle Ages.
Right.
But anyway, we have a fragment of a Sumerian version of the flood. Atrahasis is the longest version that we have. The Gilgamesh epic, which is a very, very long epic, in the standard version, has a sort of a Reader's Digest version of the flood story that we have in Atrahasis. And just to confuse the mix, when George Smith found the flood epic in the 1870s, he found the Gilgamesh version. When he went back to find another fragment, he found the Atrahasis version. He didn't realize they were two different editions.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And so in fact, here's the problem with the Gilgamesh epic. We have old Babylonian versions of individual pieces of the epic, which were woven together a few centuries later, but we don't have either of them in total. And so when somebody translates the Gilgamesh epic, they have to take some of the old Babylonian fragments and they have to take some of the later fragments.
Oh, I got you.
Slice them together. And so it's as if you've got this puzzle piece, and right now we probably have 60%, and some of it's duplicated. It would be like me taking all my class notes, and let's say I've updated it over here and over here, and I threw them up in the air and I ripped all the pages, and then now I'm trying to put it all together and I don't realize what edition is this? Is this the 2014 one or the 2006 one? Well, that's the problem that we have trying to put all this stuff together. The flood story in Gilgamesh actually doesn't fit really well. It's sort of a long aside. Gilgamesh has been going on his journey, and all of a sudden he finally meets the hero of the flood, Utnapishtim.
Yeah.
And Utnapishtim now gives him the long account of the flood, which evidently is probably quite familiar to people. And so the larger expanded version is Atrahasis. And just before we go into it, Irving Finkel of the British Museum, and if you don't know who he is, you've got to look him up. About 10 years ago, he wrote this really cool little book, The Ark Before Noah.
What is his name again?
Irving Finkel.
Irvin.
Finkel. So he's in the British Museum. He's one of the keepers of the Babylonian museum part, and he would occasionally have people coming in with tablet collections or pieces of tablets. He had a guy come in the late 80s, and the fellow had a fragment of a text, and it actually is an expansion of the Atrahasis epic, about 60 lines of discussion of the exact nature of the boat that was in the Atrahasis epic story.
Wow.
And by the way, it's a circular boat, which would
Yeah.
be very typical of what you would expect in the southern regions of Mesopotamia. But anyway, it's kind of a nice addition. The problem is the fellow didn't want to leave the tablet with him. And so it was about a decade before Finkel got access to the tablet and then finally published it. And then he came up with this popular book.
That's quite interesting. So the fact that the flood stories
Yes.
are so, permeating throughout ancient cultures actually is evidence that there was the event.
I would think that there's something going on here. Yes.
Right. Because I think it's kind of interesting that everyone looks at the other way around. I think a little bit different. I'm thinking if these people had a flood, even the Aztecs have one, everyone around the world. So, there's an argument, like I know John Walton, he believes it's probably a local one. There are different arguments, and we're not going to get into the different type of opinions, which is irrelevant to the conversation. But it's interesting that if the Aztecs and all these other people have them, so the Bible then is true that there was an event, So, I mean, we start from that. But even if the event, let's just for 1 second, let's be skeptics here for a minute. Even if the events didn't really happen, which I believe it did, by the way, just for the record.
Right, of course.
All right. But we have to also examine the message behind the message. What is the message behind the story being in the Bible, which we don't really ask? We're fighting and trying to prove whether the event is real or not. I think that by the fact that all the cultures attesting that there was a flood in their myth leads us to believe that, the Bible is leaning on something that did occur, but the message is what really brings the message home, I think.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
So go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean,
what I wanted to do, if it's possible, is as you give us some of the history and do like a parallel. So on Saturday, I did a teaching paralleling the flood, not from the Epic of Gilgamesh, but more so from, biblical account, the creation account, and how the cyclical patterns are repeating again in the recreation, new creation in Genesis 6. Many people don't consider the story happening over and over and over. It happened also with with Abraham. It happened also in the Exodus story from Exodus 1 to Exodus 40. So there's a cyclical message being sent that I saw it in Genesis, that now historical accounts like the Epic of Gilgamesh kind of gives us an insight. So as you speak, allow me, if it's possible, to make some parallels between both stories. Sure. So the audience may see, how important this is for us to understand, I think.
Well, and of course, the flood story is in Gilgamesh, and we'll just take it this one. Like I said, it's pretty much a Reader's Digest version of the more fragmented Atrahasis version.
Yeah.
In any event, the flood story has remarkable parallels. And by the way, this was first studied by a really strong Christian about 70, 80 years ago by Alexander Heidel, the Gilgamesh epic and Old Testament parallels. Unfortunately, he died very young in the mid 50s, but he wrote.
How do you spell his last name? I'm sorry.
Heidel.
Yeah.
So this is like the classic work. I wouldn't say it's necessarily out of date. There's been a lot of learning since then.
Oh, nice. I did not know that book existed. Cool. Yeah,
this is a really nice one. He had one on the creation epic too. And so, and I think you can probably get both of these on a PDF file without having to.
Will they have it in Logos?
Probably. And by the way, anything you find at Logos has already been vetted by their former resident scholar, Mike Heiser. So
yeah.
If you find anything at Logos, you can pretty much bet that you're okay.
By the way, tell us. Let's talk a little bit about that, because Logos. If you watch any of my teachings, anyone who follows me, they know that I actually use the program in all my studies, and I use the Lexham Bible, which is specifically for Logos.
Sure.
And I noticed that when I use the Lexham Bible, normally scholars kind of leave you alone because they know that it's validated by
Yeah.
scholarship. So that's kind of cool. Uh, Tell us a little bit more about that because you do have a course in the logos. Tell us what's the name of your course in logo software. I want them to get it.
Well, I've got two of them, women in the basically women in the ancient Near East Old Testament world, and then women in the ancient Near East New Testament world. I'm like, I did these 10 years ago, and they flew me out there to Bellingham, Washington. And funny thing is, both times they flew me out, both times Mike Kaiser was not there. And so
Okay.
I never, we didn't actually meet until about 5 or 6 years later. But anyway, they are really professional. The library they had everything there. And here's Mike Kaiser, who was their resident scholar, had access to everything, hard
Wow.
copies, etc. And so I was amazed at how professional they were. I knew next to nothing about them when they contacted me. They had me give a talk in Chicago, and then I was very happy with the conference. And
I
they
see.
said, "Well, we'd like to fly you out here." And I said, "Sure." And so uh, and there were
I'm hoping that's an honor, man, because I've learned a lot from those two courses that you put out, and unfortunately, in the Spanish world, there's not enough information there. I'm hoping that someday I may be able to earn my way and get an opportunity to do in Spanish because there's hardly any information in the courses in Spanish. That may be something that hopefully someday the Lord would open doors. So
I might have mentioned to you before, there are a couple of brilliant Mesopotamian scholars who they didn't do a lot in Spanish, but they're Spanish natives from Spain.
yeah, you
Ruby
did mention one of them. Yes.
Gonzalo Rubio is one of them.
Yeah.
The other one just passed away, Miguel Civil, Civil.
I read some of his stuff. It's pretty good.
Well, he was the top sumerologist in the world until in many respects, until his passing. And so, in fact, in this book on Atrahasis, edited by Lambert and Millard. Millard, by the way, was a very strong evangelical Christian who was sort of like a generation before me, he was kind of like our general teacher in terms of how to operate as a Christian in this environment.
Okay.
But Seville wrote there was the Sumerian version of the flood that's in here. It was written by Seville. And by the way, this fellow Lambert, I don't have the book with me, but he basically compiled all of the creation stories from the Near East into one gigantic volume. Lambert, I think it's simply called Babylonian Creation Epics or something like that, but
Yeah.
it's very detailed. It came out about 10 or 11 years ago. It was his magnum opus before he passed away.
That's a great resource. I'm glad you showed the books because
Yeah.
I was connecting Atrahasis and you have a book on that. I only have minimum information, so at least it lets me know that I'm guiding myself in the right path, looking at the right resources. So it's kind of good. So tell us a little bit about. Let's look at some of the parallels. Okay.
Yes.
For example, in Genesis, God decides to flood the earth due to humanity's violence, Hamas, weakness, wickedness, but saves Noah and his family. Now, what's interesting is when you look into the Gilgamesh, when it's Pishtim is forewarned about by God to build a boat to survive an impending flood sent by the gods. Also aimed to eliminate humanity's noise and wickedness. But the motivation is different there, though.
Well, it seems to be different because, first of all, it doesn't actually say wickedness. It simply says noise, which is the word rigmu. And it sort of implies, if you look at the composite of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, is that the gods are upset with overpopulation. There's just too many of these critters running around.
Right.
But it's also sort of counterproductive for them because, of course, in the creation stories, human beings were created to do all the dirty work for the gods. And so why do you want to get rid of them? In fact, the main protagonist who wants to get rid of humans is the active head of the Mesopotamian pantheon, Enlil.
Enlil, yes.
And so he's upset with them, but we're never really told why. And so it sort of makes the Mesopotamian gods sort of capricious, like, well, but this is, I think, how a typical Mesopotamian would feel about the gods, in the sense that, okay, something really bad happened to me. I don't know what I did wrong. I would go to an incantation priest, and they would say, well, tell me what happened. Oh, my child's very sick. He's on the verge of death. Well, you must have done something wrong. Well, I don't know what it was. Did you make sure to give your offering to Ishtar,
Yeah.
the other day? Well, I
Yeah.
did. Well, maybe you did something wrong. And then they would give me a very elaborate ritual to do. And so I might never find out what I was doing wrong. And I think the difference with the Bible is, of course, uh, we don't always know why. And of course, when it says God's the author of good and evil, it just means that everything ultimately stems from God, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And we're not always told what the purpose is, but we know that God is good. And so and so even, think about the book of Job. Job's asking all these questions, and he doesn't really get the type of answers you would expect. Like,
Right.
isn't going to sit there and reason with Job. No, I'm the king of the universe. Were you here when I started? And
Yeah.
basically says, I guess I better shut my mouth. Um,
Right.
and so the same thing with the flood story is that, and I don't want to go into this. Maybe this might be another lecture, but at the beginning of Genesis, it actually sets the stage for what's going on, but it's so brief. It's about, of course, the sons of God and the daughters of men.
Right.
And so something's really fishy is going on there. And by the way, there's a Mesopotamian parallel that is very, very poorly known.
You just got me in trouble because now everyone's going to text me, "Hey, let's do about the sons of God and the sons of men."
Oh, we can do that at some point.
All
Uh,
right.
Not today, because that would get us into
But
it would get us down a rabbit hole that we would never get out. Um,
gotcha.
but the point is, that's in other words, without that prelude, the flood doesn't make a lot of sense. Something's going on that's very, very wrong. And then God, of course, is comparing that to Noah and the righteous one. And by the way, righteous really just means right. He's the correct one.
Right.
Uh,
Right. Sadiq.
you know and of course the fact that his name means rest sort of implies that something's going on, just like Abel's name. Something bad's going to happen when the guy's name is Vapor.
Yeah.
probably,
I know.
probably not the name Adam and Eve gave to him when he was born,
Yeah.
uh, any more than Nabal was named Fool later on. I'm going to guess that mom and dad didn't name him Fool out of the womb.
So okay. So if we mention about the gods of Enlil and complaining about the noise of humanity
Yes.
versus the biblical account in which it was a legitimate accusation from God as the ultimate
Yes.
judge because of violence, Hamas.
Right.
That really establishes the God of the Bible as a righteous judge who is rendering a judgment based on the behavior, moral behavior of the people, not just capriciousness of the gods. But I don't like you today. Which, by
That's
the way,
right.
is quite interesting because I always make mention of this in my studies. In Exodus chapter 40, we have the presence of God falling on the cloud, the kavod, the cloud on the tabernacle, and no one could do anything because of the presence of God within the tabernacle.
Right.
And imagine if the storyline would have ended there. It would have been the biggest cliffhanger in the biblical history, right? Then in chapter one of, if we continue following the sequence instead of dividing books,
Yes.
it's an amazing invitation that God is offering to the Israelites if you only understand the ancient Near East relationship between the people and the gods.
Yes.
How God says, now tell all the children, and the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak out to all the children of Israel and tell them if they want to bring a donation to me, do this, 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 this. I mean, it's for what I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong. If the only ancient document in which outlines specifically the direct instruction for the people serving this God as to what to do to find favor. I haven't found that in any other document like that.
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And I'm no Leviticus scholar at all, but it certainly looks that way from Mesopotamia. One of the frustrations is that we really don't know what the gods want. We know what they don't want,
Yeah.
and they make it clear to us when bad things happen to us. And so it looks as if morality for them is primarily ritualistic. In other words, if I do the right thing, that's right. Now, of course, I should still be good to my fellow man. They actually do have a high level of personal and social morality, but that's primarily so the the human state will be able to function well. But it's not necessarily true that the gods operate on the same level any more than the Greek gods. You think about it,
That's
the
true.
Greeks and the Romans don't want to emulate their gods. Their gods, if they're 100 more times more powerful than humans, they're also 100 times more evil and 100 times more perverted in their quest for their own identity, because they're also got their own personal issues. But the God of the Bible, who, by the way, he doesn't seem to need any of that,
Hmm.
and he he transcends it in many respects. Although he definitely has tremendous feelings. In Genesis 6:6, it first says he repents, which Nahum, in my opinion, doesn't mean he changes his mental facilities. How can God change an infinite mind? It means that he's got a strong feeling, probably towards something. He's feeling bad about something, whatever that means. And then it says he's grieved. And the word for grieved is the same one used when both Eve and Adam are grieved after they find out what the penalty is in Genesis 3 for what they've done. They feel bad about it. And so that, grieved there doesn't necessarily mean a feeling of judgment. It means that you're feeling terrible about something. You're mourning, I
Yeah.
suppose. So God is in mourning about this. It doesn't mean that he says, wow, I made a big mistake here. That couldn't be further from the
So
truth.
it moved humanity away from his ultimate plan. Don't you think that the definition of that word in itself will basically be a catalyst for the rest of the narrative? Because now the
Yeah.
story and the flood is about salvation,
Right,
because in the Gilgamesh is about this one guy trying to seek out
right.
salvation, and then we know how God establishes his requirement of salvation is if you are a righteous person, correct person, and tamim, a pure person, not like the other people around you,
Yeah.
then I will restore and I'll save you out of tribulation. Because in my opinion, I think the whole flood story is a whole picture of tribulation, how we survive it if we believe in God and His principles.
Right. And of course, that the whole point is, why do we want to recount the history in the Bible? It's because, this is how God acted in the past. And so I can be confident that this is how he'll act with me. And if Abraham and Isaac and Jacob seem to be, emotional messes and do all sorts of stupid
Yeah,
things, and they are able, and somehow they survive through this, then maybe I can too,
that's right. That's
is the
great
issue.
encouragement for sure.
And so now back to the comparisons. I think this, to me, the comparisons in the flood epics are superficial. In other words, they've got a lot of details that are similar. One man and his family survive. The boat lands on a particular place. They send out birds. And not that these are unimportant. It just means they clearly are coming from the same literary tradition, but the guts behind it are so different. In the same way, when you start looking at the law codes, which hopefully we'll do later on, is that the meaning and reason behind the codes in the Bible and in the other ancient Near Eastern cultures is so dramatically different,
Hmm.
and you wouldn't guess it until you start in looking into them closely. This is why I mentioned Bucciolati's book last week. That he's trying to show that monotheism and polytheism are so fundamentally different. It's as if they're from two polarized, two completely different planets.
Yeah,
That the meaning behind everything that happens, even if the event, so in other words, the events can be the same, the meaning behind the event is dramatically different. And of course, we are so far removed from all this. They look alike to us because, of course, we're 3,000 years removed from all of this. And so Moses and Hammurabi look alike. Gilgamesh flood story and the biblical flood story, they look alike. And so since the biblical one seems to be later, it must have borrowed it. But they forgot a couple of things. Of course, the biblical account is in the same cultural
yeah.
milieu. So my argument is, why are they so fundamentally different in their meaning? The Gilgamesh epic is actually a positive epic, because the flood story is there to explain why Utnapishtim, has long life, eternal
Mhm.
life. And though Gilgamesh can't have that, the story is positive, because at the very end, the narrator wants you to look at the walls of Uruk, because he's singing this story. He says, look at the walls. Gilgamesh made them. In a sense, Gilgamesh has lived on. He's immortal because the walls are still there. And so he actually achieved his immortality.
I,
This,
I, I
this,
wait, stop there for a minute. What you just said is very important. Something I said on Saturday that I've been trying to convey this, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I
go
think
ahead.
that point that you just made is something that I have two of my friends and students here. I was teaching on that on Saturday. I mentioned to the audience, I said, the story of Abel and Cain is exactly, I'm sorry, that of Cain is basically a story of what you have a permanent exile versus a temporary exile. Everyone who believes in the Bible and the God of the Bible, they die, but they have a temporary exile, death, because we believe in resurrection.
Yeah.
And then Cain, he went away, and the Bible says he'll build the city, right? But it doesn't say he had walls in the city. But you and I know that in the ancient Near East, security and salvation was based on the strength and the height of your walls.
Yes,
So
exactly.
it's interesting that I missed that part on the Gilgamesh story, and basically it's validating the point as to why we call God a strong tower and we call him a, because now we know that eternal life is found based on the faith, not on building your own walls and your own salvation. So that means that the story of Noah is really about salvation, but not through the way the world perceived it,
Right.
but through being righteous and being pure, just like it says. Because Abraham says that he was walk before halach, to walk, and also be tamim, to be perfect. It seems to be the same blueprint throughout the whole thing. The
Yes.
message of Yeshua, the Messiah, is the same one, to live a moral life and a righteous life. Contrasting that to the whole Greco-Roman, and you study this too, so you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Amen.
It's
That's
it's really interesting about the walls, though. I missed that.
Well, it's at the very end, and so it's sort of an aside, but it's often missed, because early commentators on the Gilgamesh epic were basically saying, "Oh, in ancient Egypt, they had a positive view of life, and the Mesopotamians had a negative view because they didn't believe in life after death, or at least in a positive way." But they missed the whole point. Is that
Yeah,
everyone knows that when you die, you're now in the underworld. Um, and there are certainly excerpts of that still in the Bible in Genesis, where I think that the participants in the story are not necessarily as theologically astute as the writer is. I don't think Abraham, I think we're much better theologians than Abraham was. If Abraham would have been asked about, what we now know, since we read we read the whole book and we know the
right.
beginning and the end, Abraham doesn't know any of that. And so he probably has a lot of misconceptions, but that's fine. In many respects, I think Moses is trying to change all of those misconceptions. But I mean, really think about it. Abraham and his family, I mean, Jacob's family, they're still using teraphim, the family gods, uh,
Yeah,
which, by the way, are mentioned even in Hittite sources. And so we know that
correct.
they're there. Well, what are these things? They're there. They're probably similar to the Herms in ancient Greece. They're family deities that are there to basically protect the family. And of course, the difference between divine and human in a polytheistic world is very fluid. And so maybe I'm better than you because I got a little
Yeah.
bit more divine stuff than you do, unless we're talking about baseball. But other than that, what I'm saying is that,
I gotcha. That's an
and
inside joke, guys. Inside
yeah,
joke.
but of course, in the Bible, they want to make it quite clear that the difference between God and everything else. I would write this on in the old days on the blackboard. Monotheism is God up here, and everything else down here is not God.
Yeah,
Uh, there's your division. In polytheism, we have all these different variations of deities, and so
yeah. They,
uh,
they, Allow me to read another parallel that I found that interesting. It says mortality, right? And it goes along what we're saying right now. Said the Bible, and before I forget, hold on, Divine, just came to mind. All right. So the Bible, the fall of Adam and Eve introduces sin and death into the world, emphasizing the biblical belief in the consequences of disobedience, better yet, rebellion, a direct disobedience to a command, and then the need for redemption. Well, we kind of understand the Bible's trying to give the message of how to live according to God's standards, and there's no excuse because He has given us everything exactly what He wants to do. I think that's the reason behind Him telling them, "You have the tree of life, you have the tree of good and evil. Don't eat of that one, eat of this one." What a contrast that would have been compared to the ancient Near East, in which no one knew what the gods wanted. I mean,
Right.
that in itself is like a huge insight into God's not freedom. He's trying to communicate directly in an intimate relationship with humanity. It's like, this is what I want. But to us, it doesn't make any sense. Well, I just heard recently a question, Professor. Somebody says, well, why would God allow two trees to be there? Isn't that tempting him? Well, understanding that the culture of his time did not really have a direct relationship with the gods. And then Moses is trying to tell Israel, no, 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 that's not how it works with the God of Israel.
Yeah.
And I think that the story lends itself to understand that this is about relationship. And the Gilgamesh, after the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh quest for immortality reveals his fear of death and highlights the inevitability of mortality for humans. That's quite interesting. That's a huge contrast in the storyline.
Oh, very, very much so. In fact, it's funny you bring up Enkidu. When we were, we had to translate the Epic of Gilgamesh, or at least certain portions of it when we were, when we took our 7 years of Akkadian, and one semester it was the Gilgamesh.
It took 7 years of Akkadian.
Yes.
Oh
Well,
my.
yeah, you take it until you get it right. And
Wow.
so anyway, we as graduate students, we'd always be talking and thinking about it. We'd say, hey, well, let's make a play about the Gilgamesh epic and let's cast each other. And they cast me as the wild, hairy man, Enkidu, which I thought was pretty funny. But
Oh, that is kind of funny if you know the story.
yes, interesting. The Enkidu is basically Gilgamesh's counterpart.
Yeah.
And by the way, he expresses his love and care for Enkidu in a way that probably makes the modern heterosexual North American male a little uncomfortable,
Right.
except ancient Near East, men express their love and care for other men publicly in a way that they would do privately for their wives.
Yeah.
It's not that different. Yes.
Greco-Roman world too.
Yes, and it's not that different in the modern Middle East. I remember going over there, and 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 I found the Syrian that we employed. Whenever they wanted to talk to me, they would come up, and they were about 6 inches away from my face. Normally, if you and I were together, we're probably about a foot or two away, and we just sort of talk. And they're up really close, and then they were always very physical. And so if they wanted to show me something, they would hold my hand and we would walk together hand in hand. I'm thinking, this is different.
Yeah, the culture is a little different.
So very expressive. And so he's very expressive with Enkidu. And of course, a lot of modern commentators have tried to contact this as homosexuality, but it's actually what it is. It's homosocial. In other words, these are two of the same gender that are expressing their opinions about each other and feelings in a public venue in a way that the North American males don't normally do. But anyway, Enkidu is his counterpart. They first start off as fighters. And
Enkidu beat Gilgamesh.
Well, we don't really know. We look at it, and Gilgamesh bends his knee to him, but some have argued in ancient Mesopotamian wrestling that might have been a show to victory. So we just know, but somebody wins, and then they decide they're impressed with each other, kind of like, I don't know, two UFC fighters, if this were possible, fighting each other. Wow, I really respect you, man. That was
and I could attest that that's true because I practice jujitsu,
yeah.
and when we roll, we call it rolling. and somebody beats you and you recognize that they're better than you, normally the next response is, hey, can you help me? Can you teach me? And the other person that beat you says, sure. And then you develop friendships based on the fact that, he didn't take advantage of your vulnerability and your weakness of not knowing something. He defeated you, but then he taught you how to be better so you can make them better. So it's quite interesting. And I understand that. That reminds me of the story of David and Jonathan, their
Absolutely.
relationship. It's not like they were homosexuals. People keep saying that. Understanding the culture, understands the way
Right.
they show. I remember one time my father and I were really, really close. He was my best friend in the world, and
Amen.
and my dad was very affectionate with me, and I missed that. Never lacked love from my father.
Sure.
Walking down the street, and my father's always hugging me. He was giving me a hug, and I'm hugging my dad. One guy screams out of the car, "You gay," like saying that because that was back in the 80s. And I just started laughing because I was in high school and I'm thinking, they don't understand my relationship with my father.
Yeah.
And then one of my teammates in baseball, one of my teammates, I remember years later, says, I was so envious of your father's relationship because you would express feelings and love, and my father never did that. But when you're younger, you don't appreciate that
Oh,
until
no.
much
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
But
Absolutely.
culture has a lot to do with the way we express
Exactly.
relationship, you know?
Yeah. So anyway, these two fellows, of course, now go on all these great adventures. And you know what they're doing? They're trying to achieve immortality through their great adventures. And so they're making a great name for themselves. And of course, the gods are jealous. Why are they jealous of this? And of course, they decide Enkidu must die. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh realizes, oh my goodness, I'm going to die too. What do I do? And that's when he begins his quest for physical immortality. And of course, everyone knows that's not possible if you're a Mesopotamian. Uh, and so the end of the story is of course, not only does he have this quest and he learns from Utnapishtim, well, it was granted to me, but not to you. Uh, he does tell him about, of course, a plant of life that he can go find, but of course, a stupid snake steals it from him in the water. But all of this is sort of is 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 prefigured, like, well, of course, everyone knows that we don't have it, and so he makes a name for himself through the immortality of his building
Which,
projects. And really,
which, which,
go
by
ahead.
the way, could we make a connection with making a name for himself to the next part of the story of the flood, in which now Nimrod is trying to make a name for himself? That's
Yes.
really the whole problem with humanity. It's like them trying to make a name for themselves.
Oh, it's exactly true. And it's not an accident that that's the next thing that happens. The next narrative, of course,
Yeah,
is Babylon and Nimrod, whoever he is.
yeah.
That's another story.
Okay, so no, but let's try to see if we can connect it, because I think the themes continue, right? We see a new creation in the story of Noah. He comes out of the ark, rest, just like the rest, Noah, rest, like the rest and
Yes.
Sabbath, in creation.
Yes.
And then he builds an altar, he dedicates the earth back to God. And then there's a rainbow, there's a new creation motif, you know that. Um, do you consider the flood story, considering the ancient divine river in Mesopotamia, as parallels of divine judgment?
Uh, yeah, perhaps in a oblique way. I don't know
The
whether.
ordeal?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, the river ordeal, but I don't. Maybe this could be like a turning the river ordeal on its head.
Pretty
Uh,
much.
yes, because and I think that it's probably not the primary theme to it, but I certainly think that's one of the ways. I mean, when you look at Genesis, the 1 through 11, is it always trying to respond to Mesopotamian traditions? Not necessarily. I
Mhm.
think it's trying. The writer's trying to transcend them first to show you that this is how our God sees it, and it's very, very different. But he's not necessarily attacking every tradition at every moment. In other words, it's a theme, but it's not the primary theme. The
Got
primary theme are the themes that you've talked about,
Yeah.
ones that transcend all of this. And of course, the lesser themes melt away And really, if you think about it, all that was left from all of these traditions is the Bible until all the other material was uncovered.
Yeah, I think that also when I was doing research on the Divine River from Mesopotamia, the Eritu and all that stuff, Ea, Enkidu, Enlil, all that stuff, I noticed that throughout different cultures, they also had a motif about divine judgment, like in the River Hapi in Egypt and
Right.
some of the. So it's kind of interesting how if tell me what you think about this thesis. If in the story of Noah, we see that there's a divine judgment because of, I think that's what the accusation from God is. These people are wicked. They're not righteous. They're oppressing people, and that seems to be a theme throughout the scripture. Anytime there is oppression, persecution, immorality, then God responds to His creation. Um, would you consider maybe that the story of the divine river or judgment would be that God is making an accusation against humanity? Because I think it's Law 135. I can't remember. Hammurabi Code says if a man points a finger to another man, then they throw him in the divine river. If he survives, then the accuser goes into the river, and then he owns the patrimony. I mean, he inherits everything the accuser has. Wouldn't that be parallel with the story of Noah? I mean, he survives the accusation. Everyone drowns. There's a new creation, and now the earth is dedicated back to God as a new creation.
I
Could that be
would
possible?
I would say that that's probably something that's behind the theme. And
Gotcha.
anyone living in this environment knows about the river ordeal, and so they would see the irony in this is that
Got it.
that God
Yes.
and the writer doesn't have to explain that to us any more than if I don't know if I wear a red, white, and blue
Yeah.
coat or a MAGA hat or something, it's like everyone knows what I'm
Right.
doing. And by the way, think about it in 2048, if I wore a MAGA hat, it's like what's that?
That's
Oh, that
true.
was from a couple of generations ago. That
Yeah. Yeah.
or if I wear a Goldwater pin or whatever, like
Oh, the
what's
rotary phones now with the young people that they don't know what to do with it. You know,
yeah. Well,
I'm
so
not that far removed.
and so yes, I think that though I don't know whether the writer is explicitly thinking about the river ordeal, you certainly can make that effort. And maybe somebody's even written a paper on that. I'll have to go look it up, trying to make the connection between the flood account and the river ordeal. If they haven't, it might be a nice dissertation topic. Uh,
Man, that's what I'm trying to do for my. I'm having a tough time writing my proposal.
it's hard, isn't it?
It's challenging, man. I'm trying to do it. I actually I would love to have the opportunity someday with time to if you will give me the honor to share what my thesis will be. And
Sure.
I would love to get your input and your corrections because I think it's alongside this theme in particular about life and death, new creation. It's all based on resurrection, which is the theme of the whole Noah experience. I think coming out of the ark is a type of resurrection, and the
Yes.
Messiah said it, just as in the days of Noah, so
Yeah.
shall be. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly right.
So
That'd be
I,
fun.
I got another question for you.
All right.
All right, in regards to how much time you got, by the way?
What are we just about three? So what 10 or 15 minutes would be good for me?
Perfect. Okay. So when people so so we already established that the Gilgamesh is compiling when they discover them, they compile them with different epics
Yes.
that kind of correlates with each other.
Yeah.
So would you then agree with me that when we read these stories in the Bible, if we do not understand the cultural background behind the story, it's not going to make sense to us? Like you just said, I mean, there's an underlying theme under the story that he's trying to connect. But if we don't know these things, we may not see it.
I would say it makes less sense for us because if somebody asks me, do I have to know the background? My answer is no, but wouldn't you want to know the background? What it makes your experience as a Christian richer and deeper
Mhm.
and stronger, I think, if you know the background. Um, Does it make you a better Christian? Not necessarily in the sense that if I'm bent towards evil, the more knowledge I have, I can now, I can use it in a worse way. So I have to be careful. If I'm living my life right for God to begin with, then this material can only help me understand. But could I simply read the flood story without any background to it? Yes, just like a 4-year-old could. If I talk to my granddaughter and tell her the flood story, she can understand it and realize that there's a God that expects that I do right things and is merciful to me. But wouldn't I want to know more than I did when I was 4 years old or 8 years old or 20 years old? And so this and I don't know about anybody else, but the reason I got into this field originally was because it was fun. I
Yeah.
enjoyed learning about this stuff. And then
Yeah.
as I matured in it, I realized, oh, this is more than just fun. It really provides a deeper perspective on things. And so now I understand better
Yeah.
why God would do this. And so I think you're right. A background like the river ordeal just gives me a deeper texture to it. Kind of like the example I made maybe last time is that it's kind of like watching black and white TV and then
Yeah.
high definition. I'll say, oh, look at all the things I can see now that I couldn't see, when I watched this film. Uh,
It's like the another example I will consider is there's two actually in Acts 19 when it talks about Ephesus as a temple warden, and then when I went to Ephesus and I learned one word, it's I just forgot the word,
uh,
neokoros,
oh,
which is temple warden, and what it
right.
meant.
Yes.
It's like all of a sudden now that piece of information now gives me greater insight into the seven churches of Revelation and
Yeah.
what that meant to them. I'm going like, oh, now I understand why the decree was sent in order. Anyway, so in regards to age, let me go back a little bit. I just thought about it while you were talking. I'm thinking about something you said.
All right.
We know that Enkidu and Gilgamesh are friends, and one dies, the other one is in the search for immortality.
Yeah.
Then whatever it is, the serpent, which always comes into play in every
Yeah.
story, comes in and steals it from him, um, which basically the source of life is stolen from the serpent by the
Yeah.
serpent. It's quite interesting. You see the parallel in creation, when now the serpent is enticing Adam and
Right.
Eve to do the same.
Right.
And then we see, now I understand why the genealogy after the flood pointing out the length of life given to Noah, and his descendants. It seems to be so extreme in time frame, but now it makes sense if everything was about life, how much life you have after the flood compared. You know what I'm saying? It's like I think that there's a message there of the writer trying to say life can only be given by God.
Right. And of course, if you look at the particular numbers, I'm not dogmatic about anything, but all I'm going to say is that the Sumerian system was sexagesimal. In other words, they based their numbers on 60, not 10.
Repeat
And
that again. Repeat that again.
the Sumerians had their numbers base was based upon 60, not 10.
Really?
And so that makes a big difference. And so the cuneiform sign for 1 was the same sign as 60, by the way. And
Oh,
so if somebody lives for 3,600 years, that's a derivative of 60. And so most of the numbers, so for example, we haven't brought this up, but the Sumerian king list will list the ages of humanity. The ages of the kings before the flood are wildly fantastic. Dozens, 30,000 years a crack, you know,
okay.
etc. And then it says very tersely about halfway through the text, then the flood swept over. And it doesn't talk about the flood, and then it moves on. And then when you bring it back up, the ages have gotten down to a paltry, 900, 700. Gilgamesh only lives 126 years. Then,
Hmm.
it's just the nothing, and the principle is the same in the Bible, of course, is that we have, 900s of years before the flood, except for Enoch, of course. And then after the flood, they dramatically shift down, and after a number of generations, they become pretty normalized
Right.
at 70. Okay. Well, no explanation is given for it. One person has theorized that the biblical writer is using a sexagesimal system before the flood and then not afterwards, but I don't know. Nobody knows. But
Yeah.
clearly, God, no explanation is given or needed, except that it's pretty common idea that before the flood, people lived at it to an advanced age, and after the flood, it became, pronouncedly,
Right.
less and less until it leveled off. And everybody has their opinion as to why, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that's interesting. I never heard about that before. That's the first time I've ever heard about that. Like, I'm going to be looking more and more into that.
Look
That's
up the Sumerian king list.
okay. Sumerian king list.
Yes.
You know, the more we study, the more I study this, and now that I have the opportunity to ask you questions directly, is you can read certain things in a book, and I'm sure you can relate with this. You read it, but then you meet the person,
Yep.
and then when you meet the person, all of a sudden now when you go back and you read it, it's like, oh, it makes sense now.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. It's not like we're talking about every little detail that you've taught. Well, when I go back and I read, some of the stuff you produce or some of the stuff you have edited, co-edited, I'm understanding better because I'm getting to know the mindset of the person who's trying to put everything together. And that's, I think, is the same thing as what we're trying to do. We're trying
Well,
to,
yeah, because you can't dialogue with the text. You can dialogue with a person. So, what did you mean when you said such and such? Oh, I meant this. You
yeah.
know, oh, now I understand why you wrote this. I mean, that's the whole point, and that's why it is important to be able to
So
interact with people.
So when we understand these stories, right, and we allowed ourselves to think outside the box, I think the problem with religion at times is that we are wanting to put the message in a box without understanding the surrounding nations, and I have to completely remove myself from that because otherwise I'm always going to apply my own interpretation,
Yep.
thinking from the Western perspective, and it doesn't line up. Um, that happened to me when I went and studied Greco-Roman world until I went to Turkey, Rome, and Greece this spring, and everything changed for me.
Yeah.
Just being there in Ephesus, and then I went to Magnesia, and then I went to Laodicea, and then I went to Hierapolis, then I went to all these places, and I'm standing there, I'm going like, "Oh, that's what Paul was talking about." And now when I read it and I hear the explanation from somebody who's never been there, it's like night and day. You're thinking, am I pretending to know everything? It's just that I got finally the background to what they're saying. And unfortunately, we don't have enough background from ancient Near East except the ancient texts. So
Yeah.
we're trying to really formulate more or less the storyline with what we have. And it's not a lot, really. There is a lot, but in regards to physical evidence, there isn't really too much per se as we do in the Greco-Roman world.
Well, that and the fact that we have no historian giving us this long general account of all this stuff. And so, like we have in the classical world, and so, and no manual telling us how to explain all this material. And so it's really, really difficult. And it's very humbling because it means that I have to give a bunch of tentative ideas. And I think for the religious person, by the way, this is all very threatening too. That, I didn't learn this before. Why is this coming out, and how does this match with what I know? Didn't God just, he just bring the Ten Commandments down from heaven and attach
Yeah.
them to Moses? And I said, well, yes and no. I mean, of course that is, but Moses lived in a real environment. And so this is why, the laws are written in a way that would make sense to a person living in the late Bronze Age, not in the, you know,
Yeah.
into the dirty diaper and plastic age that we're living in.
Man, I struggle with that with when I present the temple to people.
Yeah.
It's challenging because today's mindset of the believer in regards to the structure of the temple is completely obscure based on the what Paul is trying to convey to people in the diaspora and the dispersion.
Right.
And I'm very pro temple understanding this function, but when I begin to study like ancient Near East about the multiple resurrection, which by the way, I present this to a few people. I told them, where in the five books of Moses does it literally says that you're going to die and then resurrect. And you're not going to find a text, a verse that literally says you die and resurrect in
Right.
our language.
Right.
But you will find the motif in their language the way they understood that.
Yes.
And this is an example of that. And this interesting why then Yeshua walked on water and why, you start, he calms the storm, being that a Baal cycle, and the storm god. Now
Yep.
all of a sudden you see the contrast that what the Messiah is trying to do. And it's fascinating to get a glimpse into the ancient world living in the 21st century. It's kind of cool.
Amen.
I
Absolutely.
want to thank you for always being willing to share with me. And what's the topic for next week? I'm already planning.
Well, I mean, if you want, we could go into law.
Man, that would be great. Biblical law, which,
Yeah.
by the way, is I've been having certain not arguments. You know what's great talking to you? Because speaking with you is an exchange of ideas. Not once we've talked about anything convincing each other about theology. Not once. I mean,
No.
we believe in the God of Israel, we believe in the Messiah. And I'm trying to learn from you in the areas that you really know and I want to know more about. I want to be on point. I want to do the right thing. But sometimes speaking to the audience, and I'm sure you dealt with this for 40 years teaching, you know, talking to an audience that comes in green, and now they're trying to figure out, well, who is this man called Mark Chavalis, and why is he telling me some weird stuff that seems to contradict the Bible? And how am I going to resolve the issue now of understanding culture and the Bible narrative? And to certain people, it creates doubt because they're not understanding the underlying themes behind the stories. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to convey that bridge. I'm trying to be the bridge of hopefully do a good job between biblical context without changing it to my own convenience, but trying to understand the underlying biblical themes that God is trying to convey to the storyline. Just like you were talking about, the Gilgamesh pursuing eternal life, and how the gods were capricious, and it's all about the noise wanting to destroy humanity.
Yeah.
If the God of Israel was that way, we would all be dead by now because we make too much noise.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but the fact that He sets us apart, and He says, "Be righteous and be pure morally, and I'll give you all the instructions, so then you'll know what to do to find favor in my eyes." To me, that's amazing quality that God has that is beyond my understanding, and I've only grasped it because of ancient Near Eastern history and culture. So,
Yeah. And
what you were saying?
I can wrap it up by saying, you're absolutely right that I can easily be looked upon with suspicion, and so my goal should be to be winsome and to draw you along, say, hey, this shouldn't be threatening, and let me show you why it's not threatening. And I can even say, like, and start off by saying, don't worry, Jesus loves me. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. We've already established that. And so
Right.
these are all the footnotes that are added to that little statement that you can learn when you're 4 years old. And so now, don't be threatened by it. Don't be threatened by the fact that the Mesopotamian flood story is at least a half a millennium older. Don't be threatened by the Hammurabi laws being so similar, etc. And then I'll ask a person, what do you base your faith on? Are you basing it on your ability to understand the text, your interpretation of the text? Did you put all your theological ducks in a row and you found out that one of the ducks isn't, in the right place? Then you better move your ducks then.
That is so true.
And so my goal is to be humble. It doesn't always work out that way. It's really easy to either be arrogant or to get frustrated or short. And so but the more I learn and the more I find out that I was wrong about something, the easier it is to say, hey, I don't know about that one, I'll go study it, or I used to think that way but I was wrong.
That's
Or
right.
like my father always used to tell me, I thought I was mistaken once, but I was wrong.
Correct.
Yeah. So anyway.
Well, I mean, I feel the same way, and I've said it many times. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me again, and don't go anywhere. I want to talk to you a little bit more real quick
All
after I'm
right.
done. But I want to thank every single one of you who joined me here today with Professor Mark Chavalis. And please come back. Well, next week. I think I'm going out of town. So if we don't meet on Monday, we will definitely meet that week. But we're going to talk about ancient laws in contrast with the biblical law. That'll be my part. And I really want to know about, ancient laws. It's be kind of cool. So I want to thank you for joining us. Please, if you like what we're doing, just please go to wisdomintorah.com, wisdomintorah.com. Subscribe and study with us. And remember, the more you study, the less you know. And the less you know, the more you grow.
Yeah.
Shalom, guys. Take care. Bye bye.